Not just any screaming. This was the bone-chilling, glass-shattering wail of something that could probably eat him for breakfast and still have room for seconds. Marcus gripped his tablet tighter, reminding himself that he really needed this job. Mr. Chen? The voice belonged to a creature that stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light itself. 2 pairs of golden eyes studied him with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. I am Keth Vara, matriarch of House Shadowclaw. Thank you for responding to our unique employment opportunity. Marcus nodded, trying not to let his voice crack. Thank you for considering me, ma'am, though I have to ask, what exactly was that sound? Another shriek echoed from deeper within the massive ship, followed by what sounded like metal being torn apart. Kethavara's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. That would be our offspring. They are energetic today. The understatement of the century, Marcus thought. He'd answered the job posting on a desperate whim. Babysitting position, excellent pay, interspecies household, must be comfortable with large predators. He'd assumed it meant cats. Really big cats, maybe. He had not assumed it meant the most feared apex predator species in the known galaxy. The Veltar were legends whispered about in spacer bars, living shadows that hunted in packs, beings so perfectly evolved for killing that entire star systems would surrender rather than face them in battle. They were beautiful in the way a black hole was beautiful, mesmerizing, powerful, and absolutely deadly. And apparently, they needed a babysitter. Your resume is interesting, Kethavara continued, leading him through corridors lined with what looked like trophy weapons from 100 different worlds. You list experience with difficult children and crisis management. Can you elaborate? Marcus cleared his throat. I worked at Camp Wildwood for 3 summers. That's where we sent the kids who got kicked out of regular camps. Think of it as rehabilitation through outdoor adventure. Ah, Kethavara nodded approvingly. And the crisis management? Same camp. Ever try to talk a homesick 12-year-old out of a tree while bears circle below? Or negotiate with a teenager who's barricaded himself in the mess hall with 2 weeks' worth of marshmallows? Another crash echoed from ahead, followed by angry chittering in a language that sounded like grinding glass. The job, Kethavara said as they walked, requires someone who can keep up with our young ones while my mate and I attend the Galactic Council Summit on Kepler Prime. The previous 12 candidates did not work out. What happened to them? Kethavara's silence stretched just long enough to be terrifying. They entered what Marcus could only describe as a playground designed by someone's nightmares. The ceiling soared 40 feet high, crisscrossed with metal beams and climbing structures that looked more like medieval torture devices than toys. The walls were scored with claw marks deep enough to hide his fist in, and in the center of this chaos were the children, 3 of them, each roughly the size of a small horse, covered in scales that shifted color with their emotions. Right now, those scales were flashing angry reds and warning oranges as they... Were they fighting over something? Zeph, Lisa, Crix. Kethavara's voice cut through the noise like a blade. We have a guest. The 3 young Veltar froze, turning to stare at Marcus with eyes that held the same predatory intelligence as their mother's. The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the smallest one, Crix, if Marcus had heard right, let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a laugh. Another human? Mother, the last one lasted only 4 hours before running away screaming. This one ran crying, added Lysa, the middle child, her scales shifting to amused purples. Remember? He kept calling for his mother. Zeph, clearly the eldest and largest, simply stared at Marcus with unblinking golden eyes. This one's smaller than the others, and he smells different. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead but forced himself to step forward. Hi there, I'm Marcus. What were you 3 fighting about? The question caught them off guard. They looked at each other, then back at him. We weren't fighting, Crix said, scales shifting to defensive yellows. We were discussing. Loudly, Lysa added. With claws, Zeph finished. Marcus nodded seriously. Ah, The old discussion with claws method. Classic. So what's the topic of today's heated debate? This time, all three started talking at once. Zeph says humans are weak, but I say they might be clever instead. And Lisa thinks they're just stupid enough to be interesting. Enough! Kethavara's roar silenced them instantly. She turned to Marcus, looking embarrassed. Perhaps we should discuss the specifics of the position in my private study. But Marcus held up a hand. Actually, I think they raise a valid point. Mind if I answer their question? Kethavara's 4 eyes blinked in surprise. I suppose not. Marcus sat down cross-legged on the floor, which put him at roughly eye level with the young Veltar. You want to know about humans? Here's the thing, you're all right in a way. The children leaned forward, curious despite themselves. We are weak, physically speaking. I couldn't take any of you in a straight fight, and I'd probably lose arm wrestling. To your baby sister if you had one. But here's what makes humans different. He paused for effect. We're crazy. Crazy how? Crix asked, scales shifting to intrigued blues. Well, you know how most intelligent species see a bigger, stronger predator and think I should run away? Nods all around. Humans see a bigger, stronger predator and think, I wonder if I can ride it. Lysa snorted with laughter. That is crazy. It gets worse, Marcus continued. We see a massive ocean and think, I bet there are bigger fish down. There, let's go find them. We see a mountain and think, I wonder what's on the other side. We see space itself and think, road trip. Even Zeph's mouth was twitching now. So yes, we're weak. Yes, we're sometimes stupid. But we're also the species that looked at the vast, terrifying galaxy full of apex predators and said, this looks fun. Let's go make friends. The room fell, silent. Then Crick started giggling, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal. That explains why you're here. What do you mean? Any sensible being would take one look at us and run away, Zeph said, but his tone had shifted from hostile to curious. But you sat down and started talking. Well, Marcus said, grinning, I did say we were crazy. Kethavara was staring at him with something that might have been respect. Mr. Chen, perhaps we should discuss salary. But before she could finish, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed everything in pulsing red, and a voice echoed from hidden speakers. Alert! Hostile vessels approaching. All non-combat personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. The children's scales immediately shifted to alarm colors, bright yellows and oranges that made them look like living flames. Mother? Lysa's voice was smaller now, younger. Kethavara was already moving toward the door, her body language shifting from maternal to military in seconds. Stay here. Do not leave this room under any circumstances. She paused at the threshold, looking back at Marcus. Mr. Chen, I'm afraid your interview will have to be postponed. Actually, Marcus said, standing up, I think this might be the perfect time for a practical evaluation. The sound of weapons fire echoed through the ship's hull, and somewhere in the distance something exploded. The children huddled closer together, and Marcus realized with a start that despite their fearsome appearance, they were still just kids. Scared kids whose parents were about to go into battle. He looked at Kethavara. How long until you can deal with whatever's out there? Unknown. The attacking ships are... She paused, listening to something coming through a communication device. They're pirates. The Crimson Fleet. They've been hunting lone Veltar vessels for months. And they think you're alone? We are alone. This is a family transport, not a warship. We have defensive capabilities, but... Another explosion, closer this time. I must. Go. The children... We'll be fine, Marcus said firmly. That's what you're paying me for, right? Kethavara stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded curtly and disappeared into the corridor at a dead run. Marcus turned back to find 3 pairs of golden eyes fixed on him. The children's scales had shifted to deep purples and grays. Fear colors, he realized. So, he said conversationally, sitting back down, Anyone know any good games we can play while we wait for your parents to finish kicking pirate butt? The ship shuddered under another impact and emergency lighting flickered ominously. This was either going to be the shortest job interview in history or the most memorable one. Chapter 2. When apex predators get scared, the next impact sent all of them sliding across the polished floor. Marcus grabbed onto a climbing structure to steady himself while the three young Veltar instinctively formed a defensive triangle, their scales now a deep, worried gray. That one was closer, Zeph said, his voice trying to stay steady but not quite managing it. Marcus noticed that despite their fearsome appearance, they kept glancing toward the door where their mother had disappeared. For all their predatory evolution, they were still children separated from their parents during a crisis. Time for Crisis Management 101, Marcus thought. Okay, everybody huddle up, he said, using the same calm but authoritative voice that had worked on panicked campers. First things first, what do we know about what's happening? Pirates, Lysa said immediately. The Crimson Fleet. They've been attacking Veltar ships because... She stopped, scales flushing with embarrassment. Because what? Because they think we're all carrying treasure, Crix finished quietly. Everyone believes Veltar ships are full of wealth from conquered worlds. Are they? All three children looked at each other. Then Zeph started laughing, a sound like grinding stone that somehow managed to be genuinely amused. Our greatest treasure is probably Crix's collection of shiny rocks. They're not just rocks, Crix protested, scales flashing indignant orange. Some of them are really pretty rocks. Despite everything, Marcus grinned. So the pirates are risking their lives to steal a rock collection? And maybe some old weapons on the walls, Lysa added. But those are just family heirlooms. Most of them don't even work anymore. The ship shuddered again and they could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging. Okay, so the bad news is we're under attack by pirates who are about to be very disappointed by their haul, Marcus said. What's the good news? Good news. Zeph's scales had gone nearly black with worry. There's always good news. For instance, your parents are Veltar, right? That means they're basically living nightmares to everything else in the galaxy. These pirates have no idea what they're in for. The children perked up slightly at that. Plus, Marcus continued, you three are safely locked in the most secure part of the ship with someone whose job it is to keep you entertained and distracted, while the adults handle boring adult stuff like space combat and not dying. Another impact, but this one, felt different, more controlled. Less like being shot at, more like... That sounded like a docking clamp, Lysa said, her scales going pale yellow with fear. Marcus felt his stomach drop. If the pirates were boarding, things had just gotten a lot more complicated. All right, new plan, he said, standing up and looking around the room. Zeph, you're the biggest. Where are the emergency supplies kept? There's a compartment behind the climbing wall, Zeph said, moving toward it automatically. But why? Because your parents might be amazing fighters, but they can't be everywhere at once. And I have a feeling we're about to have uninvited guests. As if summoned by his words, the sound of boots in the corridor outside grew louder. Not the soft footfalls of Veltar paws, but the heavy clank of human combat boots. Marcus quickly assessed their situation. One scared human babysitter, 3 young apex predators, and unknown number of armed pirates between them and safety. The room had one entrance and no obvious alternate exits. On the plus side, he thought grimly, at least the kids were already scared of him finding this whole situation crazy. Emergency supplies? He asked Zeph urgently. The young Veltar had pulled open a hidden panel revealing a compartment packed with gear. Basic medical kit, emergency food, communications equipment, and... He paused, pulling out something that looked like a small cannon. Mother's backup weapon. Of course she has a backup weapon, Marcus muttered. Can any of you use it? All 3 children shook their heads. Right, of course not. That would be too easy. He grabbed the weapon, surprised by its weight, and checked. What he hoped was a power indicator. Green lights meant good, right? Okay, here's what we're going to do. The footsteps in the corridor had stopped right outside their door. "We're going to play a game called Protect the Human." Marcus moved to position himself between the children and the door. "Rules are simple. You three stay behind me, and no matter what happens, you do not engage unless I tell you to. Got it?" "But we're Veltar," Zeph protested. "We're supposed to protect—" "Your children," Marcus cut him off. "And right now, I'm the adult in charge. That means my job is to keep you safe, not the other way around." The door's locking mechanism began to spark and smoke. Someone was cutting through it. "Besides," Marcus added with a grin that felt only slightly forced, "you wanted to know what makes humans crazy? You're about to find out." The door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. 3 figures in battle armor stepped through the smoking entrance, weapons raised and scanning the room. Pirates, definitely. Their armor was mismatched, scavenged gear, and their weapons looked like they'd been jury-rigged from spare parts. But they moved with the confidence of people who'd done this before. "Well, well," the lead pirate said, his voice distorted by his helmet's speakers. "What do we have here? 3 little monsters and their pet human." Marcus raised the Veltar weapon, hoping it looked more intimidating than he felt. "Actually, I prefer babysitter, and visiting hours are over." The pirate laughed. "You're kidding, right? You think you can take on 3 armed professionals with whatever that antique is?" "Probably not," Marcus admitted cheerfully. "But here's the thing about humans, we don't have to win, we just have to make you regret starting the fight." The pirate's laugh cut off abruptly as Marcus pulled the trigger. The weapon's recoil nearly knocked him off his feet, but the energy blast caught the lead pirate center mass and sent him flying backward into the corridor. The other 2 immediately opened fire, forcing Marcus to dive behind one of the climbing structures. "Stay down," he yelled to the children as energy bolts sizzled past his head, but when he looked back, his heart nearly stopped. The 3 young Veltar weren't cowering in fear anymore. Their scales had shifted to deep angry reds and their eyes had taken on a predatory glow that made them look suddenly, unmistakably dangerous. "Nobody," Zeph said in a voice that carried harmonics of his mother's battle roar, "threatens our human." What happened next would be talked about in pirate bars for years to come. The children moved like liquid shadow, separating and flanking the remaining pirates with an instinctive pack-hunting behavior that was purely Veltar. The pirates, trained to fight adults, weren't prepared for opponents who were child-sized but moved like professional killers. Lisa went low, her claws finding the weak points in armor joints. Crix went high, leaping from climbing structure to climbing structure like gravity was optional. And Zeph went straight through the middle, using his size advantage to simply bowl over anyone in his path. It was over in seconds. Marcus stood up, slowly, still holding the smoking weapon, and looked at the 3 young Veltar standing over 2 unconscious pirates. Their scales were still showing aggressive colors, but their expressions were almost sheepish. "We know you said not to engage," Lisa said quickly, "but they were shooting at you. And you're our human now," Crix added firmly. "Nobody hurts our human." Marcus felt something warm and complicated twist in his chest. "You're human?" "Well," Zeph said, his scales shifting to embarrassed blues, "if you'll have us. The job interview isn't over yet, is it?" Before Marcus could answer, Kethavara's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. "All clear. Hostile vessels have been disabled. Any injuries report to medical bay immediately." The children's scales shifted back to normal colors, and they suddenly looked like regular kids again. Tired, slightly overwhelmed kids who had just been through their first real combat situation. "Everyone okay?" Marcus asked, doing a quick head count. 3 nods, but he could see the adrenaline crash starting to hit them. "All right then, how about we clean up this mess before your parents get back? I have a feeling this room is supposed to look less like a war zone." As they began dragging unconscious pirates into the corridor, Crix looked up at him with those impossibly old eyes. "Marcus, are you going to take the job?" Marcus looked around at the destroyed playroom, the unconscious pirates, and the 3 young apex predators who had just risked their lives to protect him. He thought about the absolute insanity of his current situation, the certain knowledge that working for this family would never ever be boring. Then he thought about the way they'd called him our human, with such fierce protectiveness. Yeah, he said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. Yeah, I think I am. The children's scales lit up with happy golds and warm greens, and for the first time since the airlock had opened, Marcus felt like he might actually survive this job. Now he just had to figure out how to explain the wreckage to their parents. Chapter 3. The New Normal, Which Isn't Normal at All. 2 weeks later, Marcus was beginning to understand why the previous 12 babysitters had quit. It wasn't the death-defying playground equipment, though that took some getting used to. It wasn't even the casual way the children discussed strategies for hunting and the finer points of predator behavior over breakfast. No, the real challenge was that Veltar children, it turned out, were basically tiny, super-intelligent apex predators with the emotional regulation skills of, well, children. Marcus, Crix's voice echoed from somewhere in the ship's ventilation system. I'm stuck. Again. Marcus sighed and grabbed his rescue kit, a collection of tools he'd assembled over the past 2 weeks for extracting young Veltar from impossible spaces. Where are you this time? Section 7, junction box near the hydroponics bay. Of course. The one place on the ship that was both difficult to reach and potentially dangerous if something went wrong. Marcus found Lysa and Zeph in the common area, both trying very hard to look innocent. Their scales had that particular shade of we. Definitely didn't put our little brother up to anything. Blue that he'd learned to recognize. All right, spill it, he said. What were you three doing in the hydroponics bay? Nothing, Lysa said quickly. Just looking around, Zeph added. Marcus raised an eyebrow. After 2 weeks of living with them, he'd developed a pretty good sense for when they were telling the truth. Looking around for what? The two children exchanged glances. Then Lysa's scales shifted to embarrassed purples. We might have been trying to prove that humans really can't fit in small spaces like Veltar can, by sending Crix into the ventilation system. It was his idea, Zeph protested, and you didn't think to stop him because... More embarrassed purple scales. Because we wanted to see if he'd get stuck. Marcus shook his head but couldn't help smiling. And now he is stuck, and you feel bad about it. We feel terrible about it, Lisa admitted in a small voice. Good. That means your consciences are working properly. Marcus headed toward the access panels. Come on, let's go rescue your brother. Again, the hydroponics bay was a maze of pipes, growing chambers and environmental controls that kept the ship's air fresh and provided supplemental food. It was also, Marcus had learned, apparently irresistible to curious young Veltar. Crix, he called. Can you hear me? I'm here. The voice was muffled but nearby. I can see the junction box, but I can't turn around. Marcus consulted the ship's blueprints on his tablet. The ventilation system in this section was designed for maintenance, not for child-sized apex predators with flexible spines. Okay, I'm going to try to reach you from the access panel. Don't move around too much, I don't want you getting more stuck. It took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering and some creative problem-solving with a maintenance cable, but Marcus finally managed to extract one sheepish young Veltar from the ship's ventilation system. Crix emerged covered in dust and looking thoroughly embarrassed. I'm sorry, Marcus, I really thought I could fit. I know you did, and I know your siblings put you up to it. Marcus looked at all three children sternly. But what's the rule about exploring the ship? Never go anywhere alone, they recited in unison. And? Always tell you where we're going first, Lysa added. And? No playing in the life support systems, Zeph finished with a sigh. Right. So, what do you think your punishment should be? This was a technique Marcus had learned from his camp counselor days. Let the kids suggest their own consequences. It was usually more effective than arbitrary punishments, and it gave them a sense of agency in fixing their mistakes. Extra chores? Crix suggested hopefully. Kitchen duty for a week, Lysa added. Zeph thought for a moment. And we have to help repair anything we might have damaged in the ventilation system. Those all sound reasonable, Marcus agreed. But I want to add one more thing. The children looked apprehensive. I want you to explain to your parents what happened when they get back from their meeting tonight. All 3 sets of scales immediately shifted to alarmed yellows. Do we have to? Crix asked in a small voice. Yes, you have to. Not because I'm trying to get you in trouble, but because they need to know about potential safety issues on their ship. What if you'd gotten seriously stuck? What if the ventilation system had been damaged? They're the captains of this vessel. They need to know. The children looked at each other, communicating in that silent way siblings had perfected across every species in the galaxy. Will you be there when we tell them? Lysa asked. If you want me to be. We want you to be, all 3 said immediately. Marcus felt that warm, complicated feeling in his chest again. Over the past 2 weeks, the children had started looking to him not just as a caretaker but as an advocate, someone who was on their side even when they messed up. It was a responsibility he hadn't expected, but one he found himself taking seriously. All right then, but first let's get this place cleaned up. And Crix, you need a shower. I don't know what's in those air ducts, but you smell like old socks. I do not smell like old socks. You smell like old socks that have been left in a gym. Locker for a month, Zeph added helpfully. Nobody asked you. Children, Marcus said in his adult voice. What's the rule about sibling arguments? No drawing blood unless it's an emergency, they chorused. Marcus paused. I feel like we need to revisit that rule. But it's traditional, Lisa protested. Veltar siblings always settle disputes with controlled combat. Well, this human household has different traditions. Like using words first and saving the controlled combat for when words don't work. That seems inefficient, Zeph observed. Maybe, but it results in fewer trips to the medical bay, which I consider a win, as they headed back to clean up the hydroponics bay. Marcus reflected on how surreal his life had become. 2 weeks ago, he'd been an unemployed camp counselor desperately answering want ads. Now he was mediating disputes between apex predator children and teaching them human conflict resolution techniques. His family back on Earth would never believe it. That evening, Kethvara and her mate Draven returned from their meetings with the Galactic Council. Marcus had met Draven only briefly before. He was even larger than Kethvara, with scales that shifted between deep blues and purples, and a voice that could probably shake hull plating when he was angry. Right now, he just looked tired. Hurrah! Did the council meetings go? Marcus asked as the family gathered in the main common area. Frustrating, Kethvara replied, settling into a chair designed for her size. The other species still see us as nothing more than predators. They want our protection, but they don't trust us enough for true cooperation. Perhaps in time, Draven said, though he didn't sound optimistic. Marcus noticed the children had gone unusually quiet. Their scales were showing nervous yellows and grays, and they kept glancing at each other. Is everything all right? Kethvara asked, noticing the same thing. Actually, Marcus said, the kids have something they want to tell you about what happened today. What followed was a halting, embarrassed confession that involved a lot of overlapping explanations and frequent interruptions. But by the end, their parents had a clear picture of the ventilation system incident and the potential safety issues it had revealed. Marcus waited for the explosion of parental anger. Instead, both adults simply looked thoughtful. The access panels in that section should be secured with child-proof locks, Draven said finally. Agreed. And we should probably install additional safety monitors in the life support areas, Kethvara added. She looked at her children. Thank you for being honest about what happened. That's it? Zeph asked, clearly surprised. No punishment? No lecture about dangerous behavior? Marcus tells us you've already discussed appropriate consequences, Kethvara said. And you were honest about your mistake instead of trying to hide it. That shows maturity. The children's scales shifted to pleased golds and greens. However, Draven added, and the scales immediately shifted back to nervous colors. This incident highlights why we need to have a serious family discussion. He gestured for everyone to sit, which in a Veltar household meant arranging themselves in a rough circle on the floor. The Galactic Council meetings have not been going as well as we hoped, he began. Many species still see us as too dangerous to fully trust. They want us as allies, but they also fear us. Which means, Kethavara continued, that our family's integration into galactic society is being watched very carefully. We are in many ways representatives of our entire species. Marcus began to understand where this was going, and he didn't like it. The council has made it clear that they're particularly interested in how we raise our young, Draven said. They want to see that Veltar children can learn to coexist peacefully with other species. Which is why, Kethavara said, looking directly at Marcus, your role in our family has become more important than we originally anticipated. I don't understand, Lysa said, though her scales suggested she was beginning to. You three are probably the first Veltar children to have a human caregiver, their mother explained. The council sees this as a test case. If you can learn to trust and work with a human, it suggests that our species can successfully integrate with the wider galactic community. No pressure, Marcus muttered. Kethavara's expression was apologetic but determined. I'm afraid there is considerable pressure. The council has requested permission to document your family's daily life for the next several months. Document how? Zeph asked suspiciously. Observers, Draven said reluctantly. Council representatives who will live aboard our ship and record interactions between you and Marcus. The room fell silent. Marcus felt like he'd just been told he'd won the galaxy's worst lottery. When? He asked. They arrive tomorrow. The children's scales had gone nearly white with shock. Marcus didn't blame them. The idea of having strangers constantly watching and judging their family interactions sounded like a nightmare. What if we mess up? Crix asked in a small voice. What if we say something wrong or do something that makes them think Veltar are dangerous? Then we deal with it, Marcus said firmly. All of us, together. He looked around at the family that had, somehow, impossibly become his family too. Look, I know this is scary, but you want to know what I think? 4 pairs of golden eyes focused on him. I think the council is going to be in for a surprise because they're expecting to see either perfect little angels or dangerous monsters. Instead, they're going to see what you really are. Kids. Smart. Curious, occasionally troublesome kids who happen to be apex predators. Is that good or bad? Lisa asked. Marcus smiled. I guess we'll find out together. As the family dispersed for the evening, Kethavara approached him privately. Marcus, I want you to know that if this becomes too much, if the pressure becomes unbearable, we will understand if you need to leave. Marcus looked at her seriously. Are you firing me? No, not at all. I'm simply saying, then I'm not going anywhere. Marcus's voice was steady and certain. Those kids called me their human. That means something to me. It means I stick around when things get complicated. Kethavara studied him for a long moment. Then her expression shifted to something that might have been pride. I begin to understand why humans are so successful as a species, she said. You are indeed completely crazy. Thank you, Marcus said. I'll take that as a compliment. As he headed to his quarters, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. Tomorrow he'd be under the microscope of galactic politics, representing not just himself but the entire future of human-Veltar relations. It should have terrified him. Instead, all he could think about was making sure the kids felt safe and supported while strangers judged their family. Maybe Kethavara was right. Maybe humans really were crazy, but right now that felt like exactly the right kind of crazy to be. Chapter 4. When the galaxy watches, the observers arrived at 0800 ship time, and Marcus immediately knew they were going to be a problem. There were 3 of them. A Zenthari diplomat whose skin constantly shifted through different shades of blue, a hegemony military attaché who looked like he'd been carved from granite, and a human woman from the colonial administration who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen. No relation, she said when she saw Marcus's expression. Though I did read your file. Interesting career trajectory. from camp counselor to interspecies childcare specialist. I prefer professional babysitter, Marcus replied. It's more honest. Dr. Chen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We'll see. The observers had set up their equipment in what had been the ship's secondary lounge. Cameras, recording devices, and monitoring equipment that could apparently track everything from heart rates to pheromone levels. The children will need to wear these, the Zenthari diplomat Velosh said, holding up small sensor patches. They're completely harmless, but they'll allow us to monitor stress responses and emotional states. Marcus looked at the patches, then at the 3 young Veltar who were trying very hard to hide behind their parents. How about we start with something simpler, he suggested. Like maybe letting them get used to having you here before we start. Attaching monitoring equipment. The sensors are necessary for accurate data collection, the hegemony attaché, Colonel Thrax, said in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. We need objective measurements of the children's psychological and physiological responses. What you need, Marcus said, keeping his voice calm, is to see how this family actually functions. And right now, what you're seeing is 3 scared kids who don't want strangers putting things on them. The children's scales had indeed shifted to anxious grays and yellows. Crix was practically hiding behind Zeph, while Lysa kept glancing between the observers and the door as if calculating escape routes. Perhaps we could start with a simple observation period, Dr. Chen suggested diplomatically. No sensors for now, just watching normal daily activities. Marcus nodded gratefully. That sounds much more reasonable. What followed was the most awkward breakfast in Galactic history. The observers sat at one end of the dining area with their recording equipment, while the family tried to eat normally at the other end. Every casual conversation felt forced, every interaction stilted. So, Marcus said, trying to break the tension, what's on the agenda for today? Any plans to get stuck in ventilation systems? It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The observers immediately perked up, and Marcus could practically see them making notes. Human caregiver references dangerous behavior. Crix's scales shifted to mortified purples. I'm never going in the vents again, he said quickly. What's this about ventilation systems? Colonel Thrax asked, his stone features showing interest for the first time. Nothing, all 3 children said simultaneously, which was obviously the wrong answer. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Marcus, perhaps you could explain what happened? Marcus found himself in an impossible position. Tell the truth, and the observers would see proof that Veltar children engaged in potentially dangerous behavior. Lie or minimize it, and he'd be dishonest about his role in keeping them safe. Crix got curious about the ship's systems and ended up stuck in an air duct, he said. Finally, we used it as a learning opportunity about safety protocols and taking responsibility for our actions. The child was unsupervised? Velosh asked, his skin shifting to a concerned teal. No, the child was being a child, Marcus replied. Kids push boundaries. That's what they do. The important thing is how we handle it when they do. And how exactly did you handle it? Colonel Thrax's tone suggested he was expecting to hear about disciplinary action involving chains and dungeons. We talked about it, Marcus said. They figured out their own consequences, made sure no damage was done, and then explained what happened to their parents. The observers exchanged glances. Marcus could practically hear them thinking. That's it? No punishment? No harsh discipline? I see, Dr. Chen said carefully. And this approach is effective with Veltar children? It's effective with children, period, Marcus replied, regardless of species. The morning continued in much the same way. Every normal interaction became a performance. Every casual moment felt scrutinized. The children grew increasingly tense, their scales rarely shifting from anxious colors. By midday, Marcus had had enough. Okay, everyone outside, he announced. Outside? Dr. Chen looked confused. The ship is in space. The ship has a recreational deck with environmental controls, Marcus explained. The kids need to burn off some energy, and frankly, we all need a break from feeling like we're in a zoo. The recreational deck was a marvel of Veltar engineering, a space that could simulate different planetary environments complete with weather, terrain, and atmospheric conditions. Today, Marcus set it to resemble a forest clearing with a gentle breeze and scattered sunlight. Much better, he said, settling onto a fallen log. Okay, kids, what do you want to do? For the first time all day, the children's scales began to shift toward normal colors. Can we show Marcus our hunting formations? Lysa asked hopefully. Marcus felt the observers stiffen behind him. Sure, he said, but let's call them coordination exercises for our guests. What followed was actually fascinating. The children demonstrated pack hunting behaviors that were clearly instinctual. Complex movement patterns that allowed them to surround and track prey with remarkable efficiency. This is concerning, Colonel Thrax muttered. They're training for combat. No, Marcus said without turning around. They're playing. Watch. He stood up and began moving through the simulated forest. Immediately, the children split up, using their natural coordination to track his movements. But instead of the deadly efficiency of true predators, they were giggling, showing off, and occasionally stopping to argue about who was in the best position. It's like tag, Marcus explained to the observers, or hide and seek. They're using their natural abilities, but they're playing games, not training for war. But the formations are militarily sophisticated, Colonel Thrax insisted. Of course they are. Veltar evolved as pack hunters. This is like human children playing cops and robbers or aliens and space marines. They're not planning to actually become criminals or soldiers. They're just playing with the roles they see in their culture. Dr. Chen looked thoughtful. So you're saying this is normal childhood behavior just expressed through species-specific play patterns? Exactly. Marcus allowed himself to be caught by the children, who immediately began debating the rules of their game and whether Crix had been hiding in an illegal location. See? He said to the observers. Apex predators arguing about fair play. Tell me that's not the most normal kid behavior you've ever seen. The afternoon improved significantly. With the artificial sun warming the deck and the children able to move freely, everyone began to relax. The observers even put away some of their recording equipment. Mr. Chen, Velosh said during a quiet moment, may I ask you something? Sure. You don't seem afraid of them. Marcus looked at the children, who were currently building some kind of obstacle course using fallen branches and rocks. Why would I be afraid? They are Veltar. Your species has had very limited contact with ours. Most humans find us intimidating. Most humans haven't spent 2 weeks living with Veltar children, Marcus replied. You know what I've learned? They're kids. They get excited about silly things. They make mistakes. They worry about whether their parents are proud of them. The fact that they happen to be apex predators is just background noise. But surely you must be aware of the physical danger. Of course I am. But you know what's more dangerous than a Veltar child? A human teenager with a driver's license. At least these kids have parents who taught them about responsibility and consequences. Dr. Chen had been listening to the conversation. The preliminary reports from the council suggested that human-Veltar relations would be difficult. Based on what? Marcus asked. Fear responses, mostly. Humans tend to be afraid of larger predators, and Veltar are, well, they're about as large and predatory as a species can get. Marcus considered this. You know what I think the real problem is? What? Everyone's so focused on the predator part that they're forgetting the people part. He gestured toward the children. Look at them, really look, what do you see? The observers turned their attention to the kids who were now having an animated discussion about the structural integrity of their obstacle course. I see 3 young beings engaged in cooperative play, Dr. Chen said slowly. They're negotiating, compromising, working together to solve problems. I see potential warriors learning to work as a unit, Colonel Thrax said, but his tone was less concerned than before. I see children, Velosh said quietly. Just children. Exactly, Marcus said. And that's what the council needs to understand. The Veltar aren't joining galactic society as conquerors or monsters. They're joining as people. With families and hopes and kids who get stuck in ventilation systems because they're curious about how things work. The sound of running feet interrupted the conversation. Crix was racing toward them, scales bright with excitement. Marcus, Marcus, come see what we built. What did you build? A obstacle course. But it's not just any obstacle course, it's an obstacle course that teaches cooperation. Marcus looked at the observers. Duty calls. Want to come see what kind of diabolical training exercise these dangerous predators have created? The obstacle course was, indeed, designed around cooperation. It required 2 people working together to navigate most of the challenges, with each section demanding different skills and coordination. This is actually quite sophisticated, Dr. Chen admitted as she watched Marcus and Lisa work their way through a balance beam section that required trust and communication. Veltar children are highly intelligent, Kethvara said, having joined them to watch. But their intelligence is expressed through play and exploration just like any other young beings. The difference, Draven added, is that their play often involves skills that could be dangerous if misused. That's why we value Marcus's role so highly. He helps them channel their natural abilities in positive directions. Marcus, currently hanging upside down from a rope while Zeph tried to figure out how to reach the next platform, couldn't help but laugh. I'm mostly just trying to keep up with them. That's more than most adults can do, Kethvara said fondly. As the day wore on, the atmosphere continued to improve. The observers began asking genuine questions instead of just collecting data. The children started treating them as guests rather than threats. By evening, when they gathered for dinner, it almost felt like a normal family meal. So, Dr. Chen said, "What's the plan for tomorrow?" "School," Marcus replied, causing the children to groan dramatically. "School?" Colonel Thrax looked interested. "What kind of education do Veltar children receive?" "The same kind as any other kids," Marcus said. "Reading, writing, mathematics, science, history, art." "Art?" Velosh sounded surprised. "Oh yes," Kethvara said. "Show them your latest project, Lisa." Lysa's scales shifted to pleased golds as she disappeared and returned with a small sculpture made from what looked like twisted metal and colored crystals. "It's a star map," she explained shyly, "but also a story about a ship that gets lost and finds its way home by following the songs of space whales." The observers stared at the delicate, beautiful piece of art created by a child who could probably tear through hull plating with her bare claws. "It's beautiful," Dr. Chen said softly. "Really beautiful." "Art is important," Draven explained. "It teaches our children that strength and creativity can coexist, that being powerful doesn't mean you can't also be gentle. Plus," Crix added, "it's fun to make things instead of just breaking them." Marcus smiled at that. Words to live by, kid. As the evening wound down and the observers retired to their quarters, Marcus found himself alone with the family for the first time all day. "How do you think it went?" Kethvara asked. "Better than I expected," Marcus admitted. "They came here with preconceptions, but they're smart enough to recognize when their assumptions are wrong." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we show them what a normal school day looks like, which, knowing your kids, will probably involve at least one minor crisis and several educational tangents." The children giggled at that. "Marcus?" Lisa asked. "Do you think they'll tell the council good things about us?" Marcus looked at her seriously. "I think they'll tell the council the truth. That you're kids who happen to be Veltar, not monsters who happen to be young. And honestly, that's probably the best outcome we could hope for. Even if we mess up?" "Especially if you mess up," Marcus said firmly. "Because that's what proves you're not perfect little angels or dangerous monsters. You're just kids being kids. And that's exactly what the galaxy needs to see." As the family settled in for the night, Marcus reflected on the day. It had been stressful, artificial, and occasionally frustrating. But it had also been revealing not just for the observers, but for him. He was no longer just a babysitter. Somehow, without meaning to, he'd become a bridge between 2 species, a translator helping each side understand the other. It was a responsibility he'd never asked for, but one he found himself accepting. After all, someone had to make sure the galaxy understood that even apex predators needed bedtime stories. Chapter 5. The test that changed everything. The crisis started, as most crises involving children do, with something that seemed completely innocent. Marcus was in the middle of a history lesson when the ship's communication system crackled to life. All hands, we have detected a distress signal from a civilian transport. We are moving to assist. The children's attention immediately shifted from their tablets to the windows, where they could see a small ship drifting dark against the star field. What's happening? Crix asked, his scales shifting to curious blues. Looks like someone needs help, Marcus said, trying to keep the lesson going. This happens sometimes in space. Ships break down, people get lost, and other ships help out. It's like interstellar roadside assistance. The observers, who had been quietly recording the lesson, suddenly looked much more alert. Is this normal? Dr. Chen asked. Helping people in distress? Very normal, Marcus replied. Space is big and dangerous. Everyone helps everyone else because you never know when you might be the one needing help. Through the window, they could see the Veltar ship maneuvering, closer to the disabled vessel. It was clearly a transport of some kind, probably carrying passengers or cargo between systems. Marcus, Zeph said, his voice unusually tense. Something's wrong. Marcus looked at him sharply. What do you mean? The ship. It smells wrong. Marcus had learned to trust the children's instincts. Veltar senses were far more acute than human ones, and they often picked up on things he missed entirely. Wrong. How? Too clean, Lisa said, joining her brother at the window. And there's something else. Something that makes my scales itch. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Red lights flashed, and Kethavara's voice echoed over the communication system. All non-essential personnel to emergency stations. We have a situation. The observers immediately began gathering their equipment, but Marcus held up a hand. Wait. Let's see what's happening first. On cue, Draven's voice came over the comm. The distress call was false. The disabled ship is armed and has been jamming our communications. We are under attack. The ship shuddered as weapons fire struck the hull. The children's scales immediately shifted to alarm colors, and they instinctively moved closer together. Pirates again? Crix asked, his voice smaller than usual. Different pirates, Marcus said, checking the tactical display on his tablet. These ones are smarter. Colonel Thrax was already moving toward the door. I need to report to the bridge. No, Marcus said firmly. Your job right now is to observe. My job is to keep these kids safe. Everyone stays together. The ship shuddered again, harder this time. Marcus, Velosh said, his skin cycling through nervous colors. Perhaps we should move to a more secure location. The most secure location on the ship is wherever these three are, Marcus replied, gesturing to the children. Trust me on this. As if to prove his point, the children had already begun moving with the fluid coordination that marked their species. Without speaking, they had positioned themselves to cover all the entrances to the room, their scales shifting to colors that helped them blend with the shadows. Remarkable, Dr. Chen breathed. They're operating on pure instinct. Not just instinct, Marcus corrected. Training. Their parents have been teaching them ship defense protocols since they were tiny. The communication system crackled again, but this time it was an unfamiliar voice. Veltar vessel, this is Captain Vex of the Crimson Tide. Surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Crimson Tide? Lysa's scales shifted to angry reds. That's the ship that attacked us before. They came back? Zeph sounded incredulous. They brought friends, Marcus said grimly, watching the tactical display. 3 ships this time, and they're using the fake distress call to get close before we could prepare. The ship shook again, and this time they could hear the distinctive sound of docking clamps engaging. They're boarding, Colonel Thrax said, his voice grim. We need to get to the armory. The armory is on the other side of the ship, Marcus pointed out. We'd never make it. Then what do you suggest? Marcus looked at the 3 young Veltar, who were now standing in perfect formation near the door. Their scales had shifted to colors he'd never seen before. Deep, dark patterns that seemed to absorb light. "We let them come to us," he said quietly. "You want to fight them here?" Dr. Chen asked. "With the children?" "I want to protect the children," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference." The sound of combat echoed through the ship's corridors. Energy, weapons, shouts, and the distinctive roar of adult Veltar in battle. But underneath it all was a new sound. Boots in the corridor coming their way. "They're coming," Crix whispered. Marcus moved to the center of the room, positioning himself between the children and the door. "Remember what we talked about last time? Protect the human," all three children said simultaneously. "Right. But this time let's try a different approach." The footsteps stopped outside the door. Marcus could hear voices, at least 3, maybe 4 pirates discussing their next move. "Kids in there should be easy. Just stun them, boss wants them alive." "What about the human?" "Who cares about the human?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Big mistake," he murmured. The door exploded inward, and 4 pirates in battle armor charged through the smoke. They were expecting to find terrified children and a helpless human. Instead, they found something that would give them nightmares for years. The children didn't attack immediately. Instead, they simply stood there. Scales, showing those dark, light-absorbing patterns, golden eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like mirrors. "What the hell?" one of the pirates said, raising his weapon. "They're just kids," another one said, but his voice was uncertain. "Kids with very big teeth," the third pirate added nervously. Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Shut up, human, we're here for the Veltar spawn." "See, that's where you made your mistake," Marcus said conversationally. "You're thinking of them as spawn, but they're not spawn, they're children. My children." The pirates looked confused. "Your children?" "Well, not biologically, but in every way that matters." Marcus's voice had gone very calm, very quiet. "And nobody, and I mean nobody, threatens my kids." What happened next was like watching a nature documentary about pack predators, except the prey was armed and wearing armor. The children moved as one, flowing around the pirates like liquid shadow. But instead of going for kill shots, they targeted weapons, joints, and weak points in the armor. It was surgical, precise, and absolutely terrifying. In less than 10 seconds, 4 armed pirates were on the ground, disarmed and immobilized. The observers stood in stunned silence. "Fascinating," Dr. Chen whispered. "They could have killed them easily, but they chose not to." "That's the training," Marcus explained, checking to make sure the pirates were unconscious but breathing. "Kethvara and Draven have been teaching them control. Power without restraint is just destruction. But power with restraint? That's strength." "But they're still children," Velosh said, his skin showing confused colors. "How can they be so young and yet so capable?" Marcus finished. "Because they've been raised by parents who understand that being strong doesn't mean being cruel, and because they've learned to trust someone who isn't Veltar." Colonel Thrax was examining the disabled pirates. "The efficiency is remarkable. Military precision, but with civilian rules of engagement." "They're not soldiers," Marcus said. "They're kids who've been taught to protect what matters to them. And right now, that includes all of us." The sound of fighting in the corridors was dying down. After a few more minutes, Kethvara's voice came over the comm. "All clear. Hostile boarding parties have been neutralized." The children's scales immediately shifted back to normal colors, and they looked suddenly much younger. "Is everyone okay?" Lysa asked, looking around at the observers with concern. "We're fine," Dr. Chen said softly. "Are you?" "We're okay," Crix said. "We're always okay when Marcus is here." "Why?" Velosh asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The children looked at each other, then at Marcus. "Because he's not afraid of us," Zeph said simply. "Everyone else looks at us and sees monsters or weapons or something dangerous. But Marcus looks at us and sees us. And when someone sees you for who you really are," Lysa added, It makes you want to be the best version of yourself. Even when that's scary. Crix finished. Because you know they'll still care about you even if you mess up. Marcus felt that warm, complicated feeling in his chest again. But this time he also saw something else in the observers' faces. Understanding. I think, Dr. Chen said quietly, I'm beginning to understand what makes this work. What's that? Marcus asked. Trust. Not just the children trusting you, but you trusting them. You don't see them as dangerous animals that need to be controlled. You see them as people who need to be understood. And in return, Colonel Thrax added, they don't see you as prey or a threat. They see you as family. Which is, Velosh said, his skin showing thoughtful purples. Exactly what the Galactic Council needs to understand about Veltar integration. Over the next hour, as the ship's crew dealt with the aftermath of the pirate attack, the observers conducted their most important interviews yet, but instead of focusing on data points and behavioral measurements, they asked about feelings, relationships, and trust. The preliminary findings are quite remarkable, Dr. Chen told Marcus, as they watched the children help clean up the damaged classroom. This isn't just successful childcare, it's a model for interspecies cooperation. I'm just a babysitter, Marcus protested. No, she replied. You're much more than that. You're proof that fear doesn't have to define relationships between species. That understanding can overcome instinct. That trust can bridge any gap. Even when one species is made of apex predators and the other is made of squishy humans. Dr. Chen smiled. Especially then. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was a different quality to the conversation. The observers were no longer just watching. They were participating. Asking questions, sharing stories, and slowly becoming part of the extended family dynamic. So what happens now? Marcus asked. With the report, I mean. We tell the council what we've seen, Velosh said. That Veltar children are capable of forming deep bonds with other species, that they can learn restraint, cooperation, and trust, and that humans, Colonel Thrax added, are capable of seeing past their own instinctual fears to recognize the person inside the predator. But mostly, Dr. Chen said, we tell them about a family that works not because everyone is the same, but because everyone is committed to understanding and caring for each other. Even when that means putting yourself at risk, Velosh added, looking at Marcus. Your willingness to place yourself between armed pirates and the children, that demonstrated something profound about human protective instincts. I wasn't being heroic, Marcus said. I was being a parent. Exactly, Dr. Chen said. And that's what makes this whole experiment work. You're not just their caregiver, you're their family, and they're yours. As the conversation continued, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted. The observers were no longer just documenting an experiment. They were witnessing the birth of something new. A model for how different species could not just coexist, but thrive together. It was a responsibility that felt both overwhelming and exactly right. After all, if you were going to accidentally become a symbol of interspecies cooperation, you might as well do it with style, and with really good kids to help you figure it out as you went along. Epilogue. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Galactic Council's primary station, watching ships from dozens of species come and go through the massive spaceport. Behind him, he could hear the familiar sound of young Veltar voices engaged in what sounded like a heated debate about the aerodynamics of Council shuttles. Marcus, Crix's voice carried across the deck. Zeph says our ship could beat that Zenthari cruiser in a race, but I think the cruiser has better engines. And I think, Marcus called back without turning around, that you're both forgetting about inertial dampeners and power-to-mass ratios. The debate immediately shifted to a discussion of advanced physics, because that was apparently what passed for casual conversation in the Veltar household these days. 6 months ago, Marcus had been a desperate, unemployed camp counselor. Now, he was the poster child for successful interspecies integration giving presentations to council subcommittees and training other caregivers in what had become known as the Chen method of cross-species child care. He still wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. The Chen method, he'd asked Dr. Chen when she'd first mentioned the term. Trust-based care with clear boundaries, natural consequences, and age-appropriate expectations that don't change based on species, she'd explained. Plus the revolutionary concept of treating children like individual people rather than representatives of their species. That's not a method, Marcus had protested. That's just how you're supposed to treat kids. Exactly, Dr. Chen had replied, and that's why it works. The official report from the observers had been a sensation. For the first time, the Galactic Council had concrete evidence that apex predator species could successfully integrate into multi-species communities. The key, according to the report, was establishing relationships based on mutual trust and understanding, rather than fear and control. As a result, the Veltar had been granted full membership in the Galactic Council. More importantly, other previously excluded species were now being reconsidered for membership based on the same principles. Marcus? Lisa's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was standing beside him now, her scales showing the deep blues and purples that indicated serious thinking. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever miss Earth? Miss being around other humans? Marcus considered the question seriously. He'd been offered several positions back on Earth, prestigious jobs with the colonial administration, teaching, positions at universities, even a book deal to write about his experiences. He'd turned them all down. Sometimes, he said honestly. I miss certain foods and I miss being able to communicate without having to think about species-specific body language. But miss living there? No. Why not? Because my family is here. Lisa's scales shifted to pleased golds, and she leaned against the observation deck railing beside him. Even though we're weird, especially because you're weird, normal families are boring. We're not normal by any species standards, she pointed out. Good, normal is overrated. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ships and contemplating the vast complexity of the galaxy they were all part of. Marcus, Lisa said eventually, do you think other species will figure out how to do what we do? What do you mean? Live together, trust each other, be family even when you're completely different. Marcus thought about the dozen new interspecies families that had formed in the past 6 months, following the model established by his own chaotic household. Human families adopting young beings from other species, alien families taking in human children, and mixed-species cooperative child-rearing arrangements that would have been unthinkable a year ago. I think, he said, that we've shown it's possible. The rest is up to them. But it's hard work. The best things usually are. And scary sometimes. Definitely scary sometimes. But worth it? Marcus looked at Lisa, this young apex predator, who worried about disappointing her parents, who created beautiful art, who had risked her life to protect him from pirates, and who was asking profound questions about the nature of family and trust. Absolutely worth it, he said. Good, she said, her scales shifting to contented greens. Because I was hoping you'd say that. Why? Because Mother and Father have been talking about adopting. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Adopting? There's a human child at the refugee center on Kepler Prime. Her parents died in a transport accident and she's been having trouble with the placement services because she's difficult. Difficult how? Apparently she bites people and refuses to follow rules and keeps trying to escape. Marcus started laughing. And your parents think she'd fit in with this family? They think she sounds like she has spirit, and they think... Lisa's scales shifted to slightly embarrassed colors. They think she needs someone who understands that being difficult doesn't mean being bad. Someone like me? Someone like us? Marcus looked around the observation deck, where Crix was now building something complicated out of discarded shuttle parts, while Zeph provided running commentary on structural engineering principles. In the distance, he could see Kethvara and Draven in deep conversation with a council representative. probably discussing another diplomatic mission. His family. Impossible, chaotic, loving, and completely insane, and apparently about to get bigger. "When do we meet her?" he asked. Lisa's scales lit up with delighted golds. "Tomorrow. Her name is Emma, she's 8 years old, and according to her file, she's incorrigible." "Perfect," Marcus said. "She'll fit right in." As they headed back to rejoin the others, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. He'd started this job thinking he was just a babysitter for some unusual kids. Instead, he'd become part of something much larger, a family that was helping to reshape how the galaxy thought about cooperation, trust, and the possibility of building bridges across species lines. It was a responsibility he'd never asked for, but one he'd grown into. And if the galaxy needed a human willing to trust apex predator children and teach them to trust him back, well, he'd proven that he was crazy enough for the job. After all, someone had to show the universe that the best families weren't the ones that looked the same, but the ones that chose to love each other despite their differences, even when those differences included claws, scales, and the occasional tendency to get stuck in ventilation systems. "Marcus," Crix called out as they approached, "we need your opinion on something." "What's that?" "If we're getting a new sister, should we build her a climbing structure or a hiding fort?" "Why not both?" Marcus suggested. The children's faces lit up with excitement as they began planning modifications to their already chaotic playroom. In the background, their parents continued their diplomatic discussions, casually reshaping the future of galactic politics. Just another day in the life of the galaxy's most famous interspecies family. Marcus couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The end.